Today I want to show you a little bit of genius. Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper and today we're going to have a look at this portrait of Johannes Wtenbogaert. It was painted by Rembrandt van Rijn, known often as Rembrandt. And in my personal and very humble opinion, it is one of those portraits that show you just how good Rembrandt really was. So, first for a little bit of context. Rembrandt had been born in 1606 in the city of Leiden, in the province that at the time was called Holland. He trained to be a painter in Leiden and then in Amsterdam, after which he moved back to his hometown, worked there for a bit and then moved to Amsterdam again. And there he would remain for the rest of his life. And he would become the most celebrated artist of the Netherlands. That is, he would become that centuries after his death, because during his lifetime he had very successful years and then fell into decline. That is, his popularity fell into decline. He had trouble getting new clients. He drank too much, he had lots of very serious financial troubles, and because his style changed over the years in a different direction than his audience wanted. And strangely, it's precisely those changes in his style that are so admired today. But when he painted this portrait, he was in his most successful period. So in the 1630s, he had just moved back to Amsterdam, where he had established himself as a portrait painter. This meant he was trying to make a name for himself by painting portraits of the rich and famous. Now, painting portraits requires specific skills. Skills other than technical skills. That is, you have to be able to deal with your sitter. Let me explain. A painted portrait is not a photograph. It doesn't record exactly what you look like. I mean, it doesn't have to. As a portrait painter, it's not just your job to record the looks of a person in front of you, it is your job to interpret the way that that person wants to be seen. Or maybe better, the way that person sees themselves in the mirror. By the way, I say photographs don't do that. Of course, a good photographer can do that. It's the difference between the clumsy snapshots that I take and the actual art of photography. But painting gives you a nearly endless freedom to add or leave out bits of your portrait. Now, throughout history, there have been different fashions in the way people wanted to be portrayed. Some have wanted to appear much more heroic than they probably were, or more elegant, and usually probably prettier than they really were. But in the 1630s in the Netherlands, we're in a strange period, art historically speaking. The Protestant and often Calvinist movements in religion had inspired a fashion for realism and for honesty. And that meant that many portraits were painted in what is now called the warts and all style. Which means people wanted to be portrayed with all their imperfections. So you could see their scars and their wrinkles and whatever. And Rembrandt was absolutely brilliant at doing that. Not only was he very good at painting realistically, but he could look at a person and paint their soul. At least, that's what this painting tells me. Now, I assume that you have no idea who Johannes Wtenbogaert was. I mean, I don't blame you, he's not the most prominent of historical figures. You know, there's actually two different spellings to his name. Wtenbogaert like this and Wtenbogaert like that. It was centuries before these things would be standardized. But when you look at him, there's a lot that you can already see. He's an older man. We can see written right beside his head that he is 76 years old, and he looks a bit tired. But he's someone who spent his life thinking, because he has a thoughtful face. Obviously it helps that there's a book behind him that is not a book for reading, but one for writing. You can see that the letters are not printed, but handwritten, which tells us he's an intellectual, probably a writer. But there's a kindness to his face, and he has the look of someone who has the patience of explaining something to people over and over again. So, let me tell you just a little bit about him. Wtenbogaert had been raised Catholic. He tried to become a lawyer, but he switched careers when he switched religions. He became Protestant, and he became a preacher who at some point became the court preacher to Prince Maurits. Now, Prince Maurits was stadtholder of Holland and a bunch of other provinces, which was kind of the executive branch of government. He was mostly commander of the armies and in charge of the defense of the country, and at the time there was a war on with Spain, making him a very prominent and very powerful figure. He was also the kind of politician who tried to get more power as he went on. He was a prince of the Orange family, and it was always feared by some and hoped by others that he would get powerful enough to become king. And Johannes Wtenbogaert was his court preacher, so Wtenbogaert was a very influential man who was mixed up in all kinds of political but also religious turmoil of his day. In fact, he was at the forefront of the religious quarrels that happened at the time. In 1610 he was one of the main authors of what is known as the Rembrandts. I guess you would say Rembrandts in English. This was a publication in which they criticized Calvinism, but probably more importantly, they emphasized the importance of religious tolerance. And he did that amidst all the religious turmoil of his day. And it is the thing that he became mostly known for, which is his insistence that people are responsible for their own soul. And by extension, that meant he advocated more religious freedom and a tolerance for different ideas. And oddly enough, that did not sit well with too many other people. Eventually he even lost the support of Prince Maurits, and at some point Maurits started to see him as an enemy. So when Maurits decided to get rid of some of his political enemies by jailing them or killing them, Wtenbogaert was in trouble. This print, kept in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, shows a list of people that were persecuted by Prince Maurits. It shows the execution of some of them, it refers to the imprisonment of another, but on that list of portraits right there in the corner we see Wtenbogaert, who then clearly had to flee the country. And he did, but all of his possessions were confiscated and he fled to Antwerp and later lived in Rouen in France. But 10 years later, after Maurits had died, he returned when there was a new stadtholder, the half-brother of the old one, and this one was Frederik Hendrik. And Wtenbogaert had been his teacher at some point, so they knew each other well. Frederik Hendrik allowed Wtenbogaert to return to The Hague, where he lived out his years, and eventually he even got his old house back. There he then wrote his autobiography and a history of the church, while he also kept preaching in favor of religious tolerance. Now, because he had always been an influential man, he had been portrayed quite often, especially when he was in the retinue of Prince Maurits. Back then he had been portrayed by Michiel van Miereveld. That portrait, now lost, was later used to produce the prints that I've shown you before. This one, for instance, was published when he had just fled or was just about to flee the country. It was produced and printed by his supporters. Now, after he returned, several other portraits were made of him. And in 1633 he went to Amsterdam to have his portrait painted by Rembrandt. This was organized and paid for by his supporters, actually one particular supporter, called Abraham Antoniuszoon Recht. He commissioned it, as Johannes Wtenbogaert didn't have much money and Rembrandt at the time was quite expensive. He was a fast rising star. But it was very unusual for people to travel long distances to get their portrait painted, because in the Low Countries there were good painters everywhere. In fact, Wtenbogaert had another portrait painted by a man called Jacob Adriaanszoon Bakker in The Hague, where they both lived, which of course was much more convenient. It's this one. It's a few years after the one by Rembrandt. And it's a perfectly good portrait. It shows the aging man sitting at his desk writing, or rather he's interrupted by us while he's working and he looks up. So that identifies him as a writer. And one of his pamphlets is right there on the desk, so we can actually read his name, which is convenient because then we know who he is. By comparison, Rembrandt didn't do that. There's no indication of his name, just his age, which only sort of emphasizes the trouble he had to go through to get to Amsterdam. We do see a manuscript in the back, so we assume that that's what he's working on. But I'm sure he didn't bring the real thing to the studio where Rembrandt painted it, so he just imagined it. But Rembrandt's version is so much more subtle. Everything we need to know about the man we see in the way he's standing there with his hand raised, placed over his heart, which gives him a more sincere look. Note, by the way, that it is his left hand, so he's not swearing to anything. It also looks as though he's just come in, because there's a black wide-rimmed hat next to the book. And he also has something in his other hand, which isn't really clear. It could be a handkerchief or perhaps gloves, but the important thing is his face, and his eyes in particular. In those, it seems, you can see everything. And Rembrandt didn't even paint the whole thing. He worked with a large workshop and was very much in demand, so he would have assistants do some of the less important bits. In this case, we're pretty sure that the hands were made by someone else. What Rembrandt clearly focused on was the face, that look, those eyes. and the way it seems that we can see into his thoughts. It's almost as if we can get to know him. And all that history in his life seems to reflect in those eyes. And that makes it such a powerful portrait. I mean, if you compare it to the one by Bakker, you can really see the difference. This one is a good likeness and a really good portrait. And as I said before, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Except that this one is absolute genius. And you can see it in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Now, if you're going to come over and see it for yourself, make sure to tell me in the comments, because perhaps we could meet. You could book me for a tour. In any case, thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.